Morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We concluded the first paragraph on page 1342, Aleph Shin Mem Beis. So let me sum it up, because this, like, in a way, concludes. Let's go exactly. I'll tell you how much it concludes. It goes all the way back to let's see here. Yeah. All the way back to 1306. So we're now 1342. So that's 36 pages. If you recall there, and I'm just going to tie the beginning to the end here. So there he was talking about Laila Kayom Yoyer, that the night will illuminate like the day, that it's not that the sun will also shine at night, but that the night itself has a power that will be revealed, like we talked about, Ein Oid, which is the central theme of volume 3 in Ayin Beis, or the first half of volume 3, I should say, that the darkness itself will reveal something about godliness that light and the sun cannot reveal. So like he says, but actually that the cheshech itself, and the nekuda the point was because it will reveal the helam ha'atzmi, which is the very power of God to conceal. The power to conceal, the power of koyach hagvul, to limit, which is part of to conceal. Power of tzimtzum, power of gvura, is all rooted in the tagberes ha'atzmis, which is rooted in the helam ha'atzmi, like we've been learning at length all the way back then, but as continued discussing as we went further through the pages, the last 36 pages especially. So that was back on page 1306. I'm not going to go through the whole summary of the pages before that, but this was a theme, a central theme. If you remember Vayorim Keren Meshiche, the Keren, all is this theme, that we reach a place that the darkness itself is transformed. Yeah. Then he said, Ubira Inyan on 1306, he said, Yesh lahavin ma de'isa b'zeyar, that Mashiach will return the Tzaddikim through Teshuva. So he asked, L'cheirei nemuven, Eichiu Tzaddikim b'alei Teshuva. How will Tzaddikim be b'alei Teshuva? Isn't Teshuva only on a chet v'oven, on a sin, and which is not shayach by Tzaddikim? So he continues to explain that there's Teshuva by Tzaddikim too, but leaves the question, what is the difference between the Teshuva of Tzaddikim and the Teshuva b'alei Teshuva? And then on top of 1307 is where he begins to bring in the idea of where God showed Moshe Rabbeinu by the bitter waters a branch, and he thrust that branch into the water, and it sweetened the water. And that question is, what kind of sweetness is it? So he talks about the sweetening the water through the sweet waters sweeten the bitter waters, but then there's a level, he says, that the gvuras einem takim ela b'sharshan. So the idea is already brought on 1307, but wasn't explained till all the pages afterwards. So there's amtaka through chsadim, which we're going to learn is the avodah of tzaddikim. We've already learned it, but now he's tying it together. And there's the amtaka from the gvuras themselves, and that's the tshuva of the Baal Tshuva. He says that on page 1307, and he says we have to understand mahu inyashak gvuras nimtokim b'sharshan. And what is the quality of that? What is the virtue over that? Over the water is being sweetened by chesed, not through the gvura itself. Allahavin calls he began the discussion of Neir Hashem Nishma Sodom. The whole purpose of creation of a person's soul coming down to this world is because the world is a dark world. So even though godliness lies at the core and sustains everything, but it's concealed. And because of the concealment, it creates a state of gvura. And what is the role of a neshama of a Bria Sa'adam? And then he continues to explain, but it's not just to radiate the darkness, but it's actually furthermore is to transform the darkness with the Oir. And even further than that is to transform the darkness from within the darkness. All this is the themes that continue through from page 1306 to where we are now, 1342. So I just wanted to put the context of it all. And if you continue seeing there, you'll see he talks about the Kalim and the Oiris, that the first step is to make the Kali a Kali to the Oir. And then the goal is to transform the Kali into Oir, that the Kali itself becomes a force of divine force. And then in that itself is the third level, which is that the Kali itself, not the Oir turns the Kali into Oir, but the Kali itself reveals its source in the Rishimu, in Avir, in Botsina de Cardenissa, in the Nikras Hatzur. All of that is all connected to this theme, that through the darkness, you can come to revelation through the darkness itself. And then he continues to speak about this transformation. And on page 1315, he goes and says, okay, now let's go by explaining the bitter waters. And that's where he starts explaining the three levels of sweetening. 1315, and then the first level of sweetening, the second is on 1317, and the third is on 1325. Whereas the first two are still through Chesed. The second is a transformation, but it's coming from Chesed, like the Aved of Tzaddikim, that the divine soul is awakening the animal soul and it transforms it, but it's coming from without. And on page 1325, he begins the third Eifen, the third way of sweetening from within, which is Gvuras Nimtokin Bisharsham, like the Keteiris. And this is the quality it's coming from within. So even though on page 1328 he asks, but isn't that also coming from a force from above? It's coming from its root in the Helam Ha'atzmi. So he says, but that root is a Koyach Nela, meaning it's not in any way revealed. So like we explained yesterday, and I explained many times, we're talking about where do we have hope and how can we find when a person is in complete state of hopelessness and a complete state of darkness, where does the power come from that something should be awakened then? So you could have an awakening that somebody wakes that person up, or they experience some form of grace, or they have an epiphany, but that's still coming from Oir. What can it come from the distress itself? And the answer is yes, because the distress is possible due to the Helam Ha'atzmi, and that awakening is coming from darkness, from Min HaMeitzer, not from the Nefesh Elikis, not from Oir. It's coming from Cheshach. Then that triggers a whole process of Teshuva and so on, where you're beginning to connect and reconnect. But that connection is reaching now the highest levels because it began from Helam Ha'atzmi. It didn't become from Oir. That's this level that comes from within the Cheshach itself. And that's what he explains. And on page 1329, he begins Avir and Oir. That Avir is the Cheshach, the Rishimu, what we call the B'tzina de Cardenissa, and all those levels that are darkness. Oir is Gilui, like the Kav. The Rishimu has both levels as well, because the Rishimu has the Oir concealed in it. But the Etzem Nekudas Rishimu, the very power of Koyach HaGvul, is coming from Gvura, all the way from that highest level. That's on page 1330, 1329, 1330. And then on page 1333, he goes and says, and now with this Obira Iyan, let's begin by explaining the posuk of how the Yud Gimel Midas Arachim were revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu. The posuk Hine Mokim Iti v'nitzavta al Atzur v'hoya ba'aver kveid v'samticha b'nikras Atzur. That began on page 1333, and that went on through 1334, 1335, the difference between Chesed and Gvura, the different levels, and of course the difference between the Gvura itself, the Gvura of Tzimtzum, and the Gvura of intensity that comes from a powerful force, a power, a great power, the reconciliation of those two elements. Gvura is the Atik, Yeah. And then on page 1338, he went back to Baver Kvedi. What is covered? The level where covered is defiled or dishonored, and there is a concealment. But then it ultimately leads to much higher revelation, even than the revelation of the 13 attributes on their own. Because it's coming from Gvuras Avatik, Nikras Atzur, which is a deeper level coming from the Helama Atzmi. Okay. And explain the difference between the two of a Yudgim Mitzarachim that comes, but there's no chet, like with the Tagber Sachais, like Bein Zema, where there's a big gili, a very intense gili, but it can cause problem because it's too intense. And then there's the concealment, and that is that's the din de katnus. That's page 1339, 1340. Then on 1340 we discussed the two reasons for rachamim. One is because you're a commensurate level of your like a compassion, peer compassion, we'll call it peer empathy, or misad reimamus, which comes from the melech from a higher place. But that too has a relationship. Then there's the third level that we learned, rachamim coming from Elikei Elam, from Atzmus Ein Sof, that's beyond everything. There's no relationship at all, and yet we invoke B'rachamecha Rabim Rachem Eleinu. And that comes through Bittul Yesh, the Bittul Yesh, and that's the last piece we learned, that this Bittul Yesh, coming from the bottom, is also the level of Chayzer, Shuva, but not Shuva of a tzaddik, which is coming from Avarabba, but it's coming from Mina Meitza, from distress, from sins. And that's the animal soul that reaches Atzmus Ein Sof higher than the Yud Gimel Mitzvah Rachmim of the tzaddik. And then he explained Ba'aver Kfedi. I'm summing up what we learned yesterday. Two ways. Ba'aver Kfedi means when Malchus will go into a state of concealment because the honor of Malchus has been defiled due to sins, Shama B'gam Tefes Mokim, and can cause an element of anger, which is siluk, like God retreating and removing, so-called concealing himself. But Ba'aver Kfedi also means, like he says through Teshuva, that you elevate Malchus or through Teshuva to the highest levels of Reimamus, the highest level of Atzmus Ein Sof, which essentially is the level of Samticha Benikras Hatzur, the cavity in the rock, Pnimius Ve'atzmus Sur Elyon Helma Atzmi. And that's the level of Avir, higher than Oyer, and that gives the power Shem Ban to transform the darkness from within the darkness, Momata Lamaila. That the Helma Atzmi itself becomes revealed. Avir Nikras Hatzur, and that's the Amtoka Gimel, the third level of sweetening the Gvuras, that also comes from the root up there, but it comes Koyach Nelam. It's not sensed or felt, it's coming completely in a state of distress and despair, actually. But it's rooted there, and that's the ultimate transformation of bitterness to sweetness and darkness to light from within. And that concludes page 30, the paragraph on page 1342. As I said, the last 36 pages, which I just summed up. Okay. Now he's going to go back to what he said on page 1306, which is, what about Tzaddikim and Balei Teshuva? Now he's going to actually spell it out. He's not relying that we don't have to figure it out on our own. The Rebbe Rashab is going to use what we just learned and say, now we'll understand the difference between the Teshuva of a Tzaddik and the Teshuva of a Baal Teshuva, and understand what it means that Mashiach will bring tzaddikim back to do tshuva. Mashiach osala savet tzaddikaya b'tiyufta. Mashiach comes and causes the tzaddikim to do tshuva. Okay, but I will stop if anybody wants some clarity about what I just summed up. I'm happy to clarify, and then we can continue. Yeah. I will point out one more thing, which is interesting. In the original Maimer Kibiyem Azeh Yechaper in Tovkuf Samach Beis from the Alter Rebbe, and then with the gloss, the Hagos of the Tzemach Tzedek, as I've emphasized and we looked at a few times, he also brings two interpretations in Ba'aver Kfedi, and I've been struggling to see if they're the same. It's different interpretations than the ones that Rebbe Rashab brought here. There he brings the two interpretations. One is Ba'aver Kfedi. He says, and to be, I'll read it exactly from inside the page. Two interpretations, but they're different. And I tell you what I think. How we let's see here. It's on in the page that we posted from Erateri Yom Kippur. It's on page 2135. So he says like this. The Dvash, okay, Baver Kvedi sheistalik b'chinas malchus lemikere. That when malchus goes up to its source, ozai tucha liris ayud gimel midas harachme. So Baver Kvedi, when malchus covered goes up to its source, Baver goes up to its source. That's when you can see the yud gimel midas harachme, which are revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Nikra Satsur, in the crevice of the rock, in the rock. So it does have something similar to what he says here, but he doesn't say exactly that the malchus, that the covet was defiled, was dishonored. He says, Baver Kvedi, he's talking about seemingly that what he says, the tshuva, that malchus is going up to its source. The second interpretation he says here, O Yesh behepuch, opposite, that Baver Kvedi means mamayla lamata. That Kvedi, malchus of Ein Sof, which is the lowest level of the Maitzil, which is the emanator, the source, Hamamshe b'chinas gvuras da'ati. That is talking about how it's coming down from that highest place. So these are two interpretations as well. They're not contradicting what we learned here because it's same as true. But here he clearly says Baver Kvedi comes through the siluk, like the first interpretation. And the second thing is Baver Kvedi, he says, is Aliyas HaMalchus going up to, I'm sorry, the first is Baver Kvedi, that it's due to the siluk of the anger, of the concealment due to sins, which he doesn't say in the Maimon Tovkuf Samach Beis. The second thing he says, Malchus is going up to the source, but he doesn't bring how Malchus comes down. Malchus of Ein Sof is the source of the Yud Gimel Midas Harachman. I'm not saying it's a contradiction, I'm just pointing that out. In the Maimon Tofresh Lamed, I mentioned Yemazeh Yechaper and Hashiveni, two Maimorim from the Rebbe Marash. There he does bring Aver Kvedi, he interprets as being transgressing against the Torah. So it could be that Rebbe Rashab is combining from both Maimorim, and that's how he comes to what he's saying. Just pointing it out. If you lost me on this, it's fine. It'll just be for the record. You can review it yourself later. But I'm not going to go further into that. Just wanted to point it out as we're comparing and contrasting these Maimorim. Okay.
I have a quick question, if I may.
Yeah.
This is coming from one of my classmates that I'm learning with on the side. We were reviewing yesterday's class and even before that. And the question is, sometimes you say when you're in the really dark, really low place, hitting rock bottom, complete darkness, you call it hitting rock bottom. So at times we've said, people have to cry out for Minametzer for do Teshuva, and that's everything you just talked about. Well, but you talked about it a lot in that summary. But then I think, I'm not you or the Rebbe Rashab have said, if you've hit rock bottom and you're sort of in the place where you could get rachamim, do you have to do tshuva? Is it memela sort of automatically that, why doesn't, if you're in that place where you have access to be redeemed, if you will, and then the Indian is whether you've done anything wrong. Have you done any sins or that require you to do tshuva? Or, some people just fall on hard times. There's no clear reason. They're good people like Eov. And then the question is, someone who falls on hard times is in despair, great suffering. What do they have to do tshuva for? And how do they get out of it? So there's a little confusion about whether you have to do tshuva or not. And in particular, if you haven't done any sins.
Yeah. So first of all, the Rebbe Rashab doesn't talk about somebody who's in despair that hasn't done sins. He's talking explicitly someone who did do sins. He says clearly, ched va'oven, that there's sins, and then the nefesh habamis feels the distress of this darkness. What you're doing, the concept of despair, period, that a person has despair not due to sins, is another discussion which the Rebbe Rashab doesn't refer to directly. You could derive from the Rebbe Rashab's explanation that despair and darkness of a person's life, where they didn't do anything wrong, but they came to a very dark place, that too can have an awakening, and God's rachamim can flow there. But here he's clearly he's talking about the nefesh habam is crying out from distress. So if you're talking about a person who's crying out from distress not due to sins, as I said, you can learn from the Ayin Beis a lesson from that as well. But what he's actually speaking about strictly is tshuva on averis, on sins. That is explicitly what he does say. So as I said, you could apply it also to another scenario, but he doesn't really talk about despair just out of despair. He's talking about one that comes from where godliness has been concealed due to the sins.
Okay, thank you. I think after the recording stopped yesterday, we had a side discussion, and you were, I don't know if you brought it as a mashal, not, I'm going to say directly out of the text of the Ayin Beis, but we talked about the Shoah survivors, and you mentioned, how do these people find the strength? And of course, obviously 6 million didn't, they didn't all deserve it. And the Rebbe said that. So
that's why I'm clarifying right now that there's two different things. In actual Ayin Beis, the words he uses, if you look on line 3, he says it explicitly.
Which page?
The page we're on, 1342.
Oh, I thought you were back in the Biur. Sorry.
1342. That a tzaddik does not have. So the nefesh habamis Meseder b'tshuva from that. Remember, there's a pagam, the pagam in COVID. When the Jews built the golden calf, that's not the despair of falling on hard times. That's a very deliberate, terrible sin. And that's where Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim were born from. You could apply, as again, I'm saying, you could apply it to also see a scenario of total despair due to bad times and difficult times. Now, I will say this. He does say earlier, before Teshuva, he does say the idea of Tzaddikim, the idea of bittul yesh, bitla yesh, where you're turning the yesh into ayin. He also explained that avodah is also a form of what we're describing here, that reaches the atzmus ein sof. But that's also avodah of bitla yesh to ayin. I would extrapolate from that when a person is in a very dark place due to not his own choice, that too you can say there's also the Hela Ma'atzmi lies there as well. But I don't know if I could see it inside the actual Ayin Beis text, that scenario. Though, as I said, you can apply it to that scenario, okay?
Yes, thank you very, very much.
Yeah. So now we continue the next paragraph on page 1342, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. The nimtze mikol zeh. So now we derive from all this so how do we read this? V'nimtze mikol zeh move on. Oh, v'nimtze mikol zeh move on. Ha'hefresh. V'nimtze mikol zeh, that we derive from all of this that we've learned, we derive and we understand ha'hefresh. V'nimtze. That mikol zeh move on. That's the way I should read it. Nimtze, we derive from all this, that from all of this is understood, the difference between the transformation of darkness through the Aveda in the service of tzaddikim in their great love of pleasures, the love of desires, which is coming from a tremendous divine awareness and consciousness, not from concealment, not from deprivation. And the difference between that, and the transformation that comes through tshuva, that is the tshuva of a Baal tshuva coming from the darkness. The Yesh, because even though the Bishneim in both of them, in both of them we explained the darkness is transformed to light. In both the scenarios. The difference, however, is by the service of tzaddikim, the primary force at work, is the transmission and the drawing down of of godly energy from above. And And that is what causes, and through that is caused that darkness should be transformed to oil. And that's the level, like we learned, that the oil is now so powerful that it's replacing the darkness. Canal. And the darkness has become light, as we discussed earlier. That was the second level of the sweetening. So the oil became a cheshach. And if you want to know exactly where earlier, I'll give you the exact page when he spoke about the difference. So there's a few pages that I would refer to. Page 13, 27, and 28, and 29. And I think earlier as well. Yeah, that's the main page. That what I just said. Yeah. And Erbe became a cheshach is on page 1323, is where he really discusses more in detail that level and concept. Okay. So that's Tzaddikim. And he continues. He's going back now to chapter 9, the end of chapter 9 in Tanya that he already cited earlier as well. What did he say there? That the love of Tainugim, the love in the right side of the heart, of the love of pleasure and desire of God, in the tzaddik spills over into the left side of the heart and transforms that as well. I'm reading on. Like he writes in Tanya, end of chapter 9, to the point that that love extends also into the left side of the heart, to change it and to transform it from pleasures of this world to loving God. So instead of the pleasure being directed toward the mayim, like he says there, toward the pleasures of the material pleasures, physical pleasures, it's now being directed toward loving God. Where did he bring this chapter 9 in Tanya first? So this takes us back as well. Firstly, to page, here we are. I said page 1323 for sure, but even earlier, where did he first bring the Tanya he brought the first time was probably 1315. I believe on 1315 is where he brought it the first time, maybe even earlier. $13.50 for sure. 13.16. Yeah.
$13.06 as well, I think. Maybe not. Yeah. 2/3 of the way down.
Yeah, he brings it there as well, correct. Where he first talks about the Tzaddikim and Baal Teshuva, 1306. And interestingly, if I recall correctly, he actually
talks about the heart there too.
He actually let me just see something, 1 second. Okay, good. Okay, so that's the Tanya. And this is also the level And you'll see here now he's going to connect something we referred to earlier as well, the difference between the way we eat on Shabbos and the way we eat on the weekdays. Remember the difference between lechem in Hashemayim and lechem in Haaretz. So he says like this, Ukumei ba'achila de Shabbos la'achar atfila b'Shabbos. It's like eating the meal on Shabbos after davening on Shabbos. So this too was brought earlier on the page. What page was that? The meal of Shabbos. I think by the Ketores, something like on page 1326 or 1327. So ubekamoi ba'achilas koyanim, and like the way the kohanim eat, which he also brought earlier. So he's right now connecting things that we are all coming from earlier places. The achilas kohanim was on the left side of the page here. Yeah. On page 1323, I believe. We talked about the Karbonis, Achilas Kohanim. Yeah, so all of that is indicating on levels where Kedusha, holiness and godliness, is extending itself and overpowering and transforming darkness. But it's coming from light. It's not coming from within the darkness itself. And so too we find in general doing of performance of mitzvahs. That we take a physical item and we turn it into a mitzvah. Like we explained earlier. All of this is transforming darkness. Ayin de Shema nasi Yesh, that the ayin of Shema, the bittul and ayin, and the godliness of Shema is becoming a Yesh. You're turning it into a Yesh, which is a physical item. V'hainu tibigali Shema kamoshu be'etzem lo b'bchinas b'kiyah. That when you reveal Shema, the way it is be'etzem, if you remember, he told it from Metzach of Ak. He says it's a fundamental state, it's a essential state. So, and loy b'bchinas b'kiyah, which means only piercing through. You're actually taking the etzem of Shema. How do you meir begili gam b'bchinas hayesh? As sheyesh achumi nasa b'chinas Shema mamish. So it radiates begili also in the level of the yesh. The ma is so powerful that it's transforming the Yesh itself, that it becomes literally like Shema Mamish. And this again takes us back to the pages where he spoke about the transformation of that level, the second level of sweetness. If you look on page 1324 and 1325, that's where he talks about this Shema. Actually begins at the bottom of page 1323. If you want to recall what he said there. So there he spoke about Shema and Atzmus Ein Sof, and that ultimately manifests all the way and transforms the Yesh. It says, that's the Amshach of Tzaddikim. I'm reading on page 1325. The Gili Shema in their bodies, that their very physical entities become elevated. Yeah. Look at top of 1325 is what he's summing up right now. So that's all the avodah of the light transforming the darkness. Now, by contrast, what's the Baal Teshuva avodah? Aval b'tshuva. When we talk about the tshuva, now he's talking about not of a tzaddik. We're talking about the tshuva from the bottom up. Ha'ikirhu ba'alos ha'cheshach. In the first, the tzaddikim, the ikir, the primary thing is bringing down the divine light. Here, the primary force is elevating the darkness. This is the separation or the clarity and refinement and the transformation of the darkness on its own. Dafke. Dafka on its own, v'hainu miyesh la'ayin. Not ayin to yesh, which was from the oyer to the yesh, but this is now miyesh la'ayin. The yesh is being transformed into an ayin. Not that the ayin is coming so far down that's transforming the yesh, but now the yesh is being turned to an ayin. Interestingly, when he said before tzaddikim, Magdala Ma'aseh tzaddikim, because they turn yesh into ayin, here now he's using that on the Baal Teshuva that's even greater than a tzaddik. A tzaddik is more similar to God because he's bringing godliness into this world from ayin to yesh. And now we're talking about turning yesh to ayin is more the Baal Teshuva. So the fact that it says tzaddikim before, you could say means tzaddikim is just a reference to all good deeds, whether it's a tzaddik or a Baal Teshuva. I'm just pointing out that emphasis. But he's clearly saying this now.
Did your microphone fall?
I thought about it earlier as well, because he kept saying tzaddikim is
I said, he faded out.
Yes, 1 second, let me finish what I'm saying.
But your microphone fell.
But he said before,
Your microphone fell. It's harder to hear you.
microphone fell. Okay.
Yeah. All of a sudden, we can hear you better. Just mamash right now.
Well, you didn't hear me till now?
Oh, we heard you. It was like you were speaking
I
far
heard you.
away.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
like a little uncomfortable listening to you, but it's okay.
Okay, so the bottom line is that when he said before tzaddikim, so compared to creation, obviously godliness creates existence from ayin to yesh. And tzaddikim, overall, they take the yesh and turn it into ayin. But when you break it down further, the tzaddik also is really bringing elikus into the yesh. He's taking the yesh and turning it into ayin, but it's from a mila lamata. And the Baal Teshuva takes the yesh and turns it into ayin from the mamata lamila, from the bottom up. That's just to clarify that expression. So Teshuva is doing miyesh la'ayin dafke. The b'tshuva amitis, because in true tshuva, haba min ha'meitzar, the b'tshuva amitis haba min ha'meitzar b'yeser, me'emek primis nafshim is gabus ha'chesher b'yeser. Just trying to read how you read this line. That tshuva amitis, which comes from distress, from extreme, me'emek primis nafshim is gabus. Okay, essentially he's saying b'tshuva amitis habomin hametzer b'yeser me'emek primis nafshi mizgabus hachesher b'yeser. That the tshuva that's coming, true tshuva which is coming from distress, comes from a deeper part of the soul, which is coming from the intensification of a deeper darkness. So the deeper the darkness, the deeper the cry from the deeper part of the soul. That's essentially what he's saying. Ukamay tshuvas, Rabbi Eliezer ben Derdaya, like the tshuva of Rabbi Eliezer ben Derdaya, whose entire life he lived a sinful life. When he finally realized and saw that he is lost, and it's only dependent on him, and only on him, because there was no one going to save him. Go b'bchia, he cried out, he screamed out. Go. Go is actually he roared. He roared with a cry, from a deep distress of darkness, of increased darkness. That's a state where the darkness itself, not due to any revelation, is transformed to the ayin, v'nasa and becomes light, because as it becomes awareness, it becomes an awakening. But it came an awakening not from light, from darkness. The Ein Sof. That reaches into the Hela Ma'atzmi of Ein Sof. So it's rooted there, but it reaches there now in a revealed way, because the cry is obviously some type of awakening, but it's awakening that comes from the darkness itself. So you see here that in Teshuva, the primary thing is from the darkness. In the Tzaddikim, the primary thing is bringing the divine into the picture. That the divine light is shining in. V'hu inyan, and this is the inyan shagvuris nimtokim b'sharshan, and this is what it means that gvuris are where they sweetened. The highest level of their sweetness, ein gvuris nimtokim b'sharshan, in their root. What does that mean? Lo ya'idei b'chinas hachesed. They're not sweetened through the sweetness of chesed. Ki'im shenimtokin ba'atzmon, that they themselves get sweetened. The sweetness is in their root because it's coming the root and source, their core root and source, which on its own is completely concealed, has now become a Vigili as they are awakened through that darkness. So that is the distinction between the two. The tzaddikim, like the second level of sweetening the waters, the bitter, and the third level coming from within, from the root and connected to the root and reaching the root, which is the Helam Ha'atzmi. So you could say that the tzaddikim connect to the Oir, even maybe to the Etzem Oir, and the Baal Teshuva connects to the Helam Ha'atzmi. V'zeu gam ken ha'hefresh, and this is also the difference being klolos habir de yosher ve'er chezer. The difference between what he said on top of the page, yosher means, remember, direct light going from the top down. Chezer is refracted light going from the bottom up. The yosher hu habir de shema b'derech mamayla lamata. The direct light is a refinement that comes from shema bittul ayin, from the b'derech, in a form of from the top down. That's how the light refines and transforms the darkness, to the extent that the darkness itself becomes light. But that's the Oir of Shema. It's not the Oir of Shemban. And the refinement that comes from the bottom up, that's the bir of Shemban. Remember, Ban Gematria Behema. It's also a name of Yud Kei Vav Kei, but it's Behema Mamata Lamaila from the bottom up. That's the darkness on its own. Is refined, clarified, or separated and transformed to light. That's not the Oir of Shema. Now it's the Oir of Shemban. The way it's in its root and its source in the core concealment. Higher than Shema, like I just said before. Even as Shema radiates as it is in the etzem of Oir. Even at the core level, the Shemban, rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi, is higher than that. Okay. So that brings us now to the distinction between the Tzaddikim and Baal Teshuva, and also tying together a bunch of knots as well. Like I pointed out, the pages that we learned these ideas. If you look on page 1329, he talks about Shema and Shemban, Erchezer and Yosher. Yeah. Any questions, my friends?
I have a technical question. And we've probably learned it, but just I'm looking for just real specificity. When the Teshuva and the transformation of the darkness, reaching up to Helam Ha'atzmi, there's obviously the inyan of a Gilui, but it's still Helam Ha'atzmi. It's still like the most complete concealment. So we talked about. There's I guess the Yud in the Avir, I guess, is the light. But so we're talking about the pre.
No, he didn't say that. No, that's an assumption that may not be correct. The Yud in the Avir, just for the record, it may be, may not be.
So where's the light coming from? I recognize it's an extremely high place, but it's still Helam.
Well, the human being's awakening is called Gili, because when Rabbi Eliezer ben Derdaya, he did not die in darkness. He died in Shuva. He did Shuva that came from his darkest place, and he brought now down a level of a Gili from a place that was complete dark. So the Gili is his actual life. He became a Baal Teshuva. There's a tremendous power in that. That's a Gili. But it's not a gili from the world of Giluyim, it's a gili from the world of Helam.
I see. So it doesn't necessarily involve light, but it's still a Gilui.
Well, I don't know what you mean by light. Light by me, define light. If it's a light that if a person from deep distress comes to discover God and lives by that God, well, that's called Gili and Oyer even. But it's not an Oyer that came from Oyer, it's an Oyer that came from Choshech.
Right, exactly.
Now, if a person did not do tshuva and did not wake up and they just continue living in darkness, then it would be the Helam Ha'atzmi is still in full force and you don't have any Gili.
So again, the type of revelation you're talking about, is this comparable to the or Shalifnei Bligvul Shalifnei Tzimtzum? Is that the Inyan there? Because the Rishimu retains a trace of that pre-Tzimtzum or. Can we connect it that way, or am I going off the reservation?
I don't know. I would wait to see. I would wait to see if what the Rebbe Rashab says later in the Maimer before I conclude. I don't know. I'm not sure. You could say that ultimately, like I explained, that Oyer and Helam Ha'atzmi do come to meet at some point, and maybe the Rishimu has both elements. He doesn't. It sounds like right now that it's coming from the Etzem Nekudus Rishimu, which is the pure Helam Ha'atzmi, and that's where the Oyer is coming from. You could say when the Baal Teshuva begins to start doing mitzvahs and living a life like a tzaddik, that's where. But I would wait to see till he finishes the subject before I comment on that. Because at the end of the day, they are going to come together, but I don't know yet where and what way. See what I'm saying?
Yes, thank you.
So I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet.
And why is the Yud and the Avir not associated with this this key to revelation from the Helam Ha'atzmi?
Because he's saying clearly it's the Etzem Nekudus Rishimu. That's not the Oyer within the Rishimu, but the Helam within the Rishimu. He made it very clear that it's coming from that level.
Okay.
Because he wants it to be completely from darkness. He doesn't want any light involved here. The darkness is the pure Helam Ha'atzmi of the Nekudus Etzem Nekudus Rishimu, not the Oyer that's concealed in it, not the Yud and the Avir.
Thank you. Huge clarification. I've been confused about that for many pages now.
Yeah, but I do believe that once we finish the discussion of Tzaddikim and Baal Teshuva, and you'll see how they both join, this may become clear why. Because you could ask the question the other way around: Why did he emphasize bringing the Yud, the Oyer within the Rishim in the first place? Why, if it's not relevant?
Exactly.
Why?
Exactly.
Okay, so we'll see. That's why I would wait to see how he finishes the subject matter.
Okay.
So we're still in the middle of it. We'll get there. And it may come to help explain. I'm not denying what you said may be possible. I just don't want to say anything definitive till I see the whole picture.
Fair enough. I respect your discipline to the text as usual.
Anybody have any other questions? I'm going to stop here now.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm still struggling with the two types of tshuva that the Rebbe Rashab mentioned a number of pages ago about seir and dvash, the two types of galus. One is from bitterness, and one is from overabundance, so to speak, of light that could cause somebody to get lost in Asher. The way I'm looking at it, it might be wrong, but there's Mitzrayim and Asher, the Navi, that we can be lost in Asher and the Dachim in the Mitzrayim. And I was wondering is that going to be tied in here, those two types of galus, those two types of concealment? Is the Rebbe going to bring that into our discussion at this later in this point?
Not necessarily.
So
Not
then,
necessarily.
how is the one that's Asher? I mean, the overabundance choice and overabundance of assimilation or whatever, Gashmias, not the one that's in the Holocaust, but the one that's the Holocaust of assimilation, of materialism.
What you're doing is processing right now, which is fine. What you're doing is bringing other subjects that you've learned elsewhere and trying to connect it here.
Yes.
I don't know if you can do that. I don't know if you can yet, at least I'm not ready to go ahead and try to reconcile that. Because here, the Ovdim Be'eretz Asher, if I recall correctly, was actually a form of total concealment, not due to abundance. But let me just see something. Let me just look at it a second. Even if it's what you said, with the abundance we're talking about is a Gilead Lakus that is so high that it burns the person, like Ben Zema or the children of Aaron. He didn't compare that abundance to Ovdim Be'eretz Asher, just for the record. So I don't know if I would do that, or else just things will get a little more too confusing here. See what I'm saying?
No, I didn't hear that last point. I'm sorry. Didn't hear that last point.
The Rebbe Rashab never connected the abundance of Ovdim Be'eretz Asher that
Right.
you know from other Maimorim. He did not connect that to the abundance of too much Gilead Lakuz that burns us. He never made that association. So in these Maimorim, I don't know if that's the way to think about it.
Okay. So that was just my process, and it has no connection here.
I'm not saying, I mean, maybe later, once we finish the whole subject, I can see how to work that out. But right now, I'm just looking right now. So I want to see something. 1 second. When he brought the Eretz Asher, that was on page, the bottom of page 1326. So what did he say there? Let me just look for a moment.
Okay. Okay, good. So okay, so do I owe you
I
any
don't
money?
think he doesn't make that connection. So I would stay away from that right now, because you could say the Ovdim Be'eretz Asher, you could say the Ovdim Be'eretz Asher is even a deeper goal than Mitzrayim, meaning it may be coming from abundance of pleasures, like he says, from many pleasures, but it's not coming necessarily from an abundance of Elakus. It's coming from actually it's a deepest concealment possible because they're completely lost. So I would right now stay away from that. Yeah. Go ahead. You wanted to say anything else? Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, so we're going to stop here. The bottom of page 1342, the end of the